And in my opinion, a data layer is a prerequisite to an implementation. Sure, you can implement something without, you can drop the code on the page without a data layer. And yeah, okay, temporarily you can scrape from CSS. But in my mind, a data layer is absolutely a prerequisite to an implementation.
Welcome to 33 Tangents, a roundtable discussion covering a wide variety of topics from digital analytics to working remotely to current happenings in business and technology. Your hosts, Jason Thompson, John Naran, Jen Coons, and myself, Jim Driscoll, all live in different areas of the world, but work together in the same company. Our regular day-to-day conversations often go off in various directions, and the goal of this podcast is to share our ideas and find new ways to engage with others. Cool. All right, we're recording now, and a lot of times we just start off with some kind of nonsensical thing to talk about. Then John or Jason kind of challenges me to segue.
It really has. It's become a game because Jim's like, I can segue off of whatever you guys talk about into our topic. And I'm like, you know what? John and I are going to get together and challenge you on this. We're going to come up with the most crazy out there topic. And you're going to have to on the fly somehow segue into this. So
has everyone done their taxes? It's April 12th.
Yeah.
Yep.
I tweeted about it.
Yeah, mine are done. I just have we got dinged this year, so I actually just have to mail the check this weekend. But they've been done for a while.
Oof. Yeah, I finished mine at about 3:30 in the morning 2 nights ago.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the only time that I could just zone out, not think about the outcome of taxes, and got them submitted. But I always cut it close. I start them in January, and then I put them off, because I usually don't like the results halfway through. I put them off until early April, and it ended up working out this year miraculously. So yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Segue off that.
So the topic today is it's going to be focusing on data layers and the value there. And so if you want to talk about taxes, and for those people that wait until the absolute last minute, if you've got a decent tax bill, you got to pay your scrounging for money. What's that?
This is going to be a stretch.
Do I win a prize for this?
But okay, in all seriousness, so this week, Jason, we're joined by TMS Guru Extraordinaire, Jim Gordon. So for the 5 of our listeners who maybe don't know Jim, he's spent time with Search Discovery when they were building Satellite, which ultimately became DTM when it was acquired by Adobe. He's the author of the frequently used and referenced DTM Cheat Sheet. I mean, I know I hit it at least twice a week to make sure certain things I'm using are correct. And then over the last 5 years, he's been building Tagtician, which is a browser companion tool to help people debug, export, and explore their DTM and now Adobe Launch libraries. So, Jim, it's really cool to have you here with us this week.
Hey, thanks. Happy to be here.
Yeah, cool. So how we came to this is about 2 weeks ago, Jim, you put out a tweet talking about data layers. And to me, I know it's been a soapbox of mine for several years right now, but what really caught my attention because, and one thing I want to say is what I've been trying to do with this is not try to have every show where it's all 3 people are like, oh, I agree. I want to have disagreements. Now, the thing is, I know going into this, we agree, but I want to kind of get into the pros and cons, both sides of the discussion. But again, going back to your tweet, one of the things that caught my attention is you talked about, with the pushback of building a data layer that, at one point you consider yourself a problem or a troublemaker in that regard. So that you and I chatted for a good hour and a half And I mean, we hit all kinds of various topics. You mentioned that you were writing up blog posts that I'm definitely going to make sure Jason and I link to any of the content we publish on this. And that's ultimately where we landed after a wide-ranging conversation. We were all over the place. We're like, let's do a couple podcast episodes that kind of tie in with your blog post. So I know I'm starting to ramble for a moment, but one, would like maybe take a quick moment, anything else that you're currently working on, you've got going,
Totally.
to share with folks. But then where I'd like to kind of start is, when we're talking about data layers, and we're going to get, I don't know if I don't want to spend too much time talking about exactly what they are. I want to get into how we've gotten to this point. And again, I'd like you to talk a bit about why you think you may consider yourself a bit of like the troublemaker with the resistance of building one.
Yeah, I'm definitely part of the problem. And before I say I'm part of the problem, it's important to identify what the problem is. In my opinion, there is a problem where people aren't implementing a data layer, and it's a problem. I don't think people understand that not implementing a data layer is a problem. And I was part of that. I was part of this this movement where we were at the time selling tag management systems back in 2011, 2012, and my opinions do not reflect the opinions of those who worked with me. I mean, my goal was to sell tag management systems when we were working on satellite, right? And the value proposition, since it was a brand new technology, is that you could put this code on your website, and without a single, like just 2 lines of code or just 1 line of code, and
I hated that
and without
pitch.
anything else,
magic tag.
with the magic tag, right? And without any other code, without any other thought, you can have your entire site tagged. Now, 2010 was a simpler time, or 2011 was a simpler time. Arguably, some folks we're still implementing the same way in some respects that we did in 2010, and that's okay, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But the idea was to sell the product, and the value proposition for developers, because that's often who we would talk to, is, hey, this is less work for you. And we just wanted to make tag management something that every company used, right? Because it wasn't as ubiquitous. It wasn't like this. It wasn't a dependency for implementation. It was just this neat new tool that these people are saying can solve all of our problems. And we had to show them that, yeah, it can solve a lot of development headaches. Now there's more nuance to it now. And we'll go into that. But when I say I'm part of the problem, that's what I contributed to. I would get on these calls and say, oh yeah, totally, we can dynamically pull in your category. If you're clicking on a thing, we can dynamically pull in the title using this neat little library called jQuery. and we could just use these jQuery listeners and selectors to pull out all of your all the data that we need to from the DOM. So it's I don't think a data layer is particularly a new topic either, because I talked to folks on I posted a tweet a little while back that I think just after Summit, volunteering my time to talk to people about data layers, just whatever you want to talk about. If you're a non-believer, talk to me and I'll try to understand why. I'd not necessarily convince you, but just try to understand why. Because I've worked with a lot of clients who aren't believers of data layers, and to a lot of consultants, oftentimes I think we're in kind of a bubble where it's like, oh yeah, well duh, of course people should be using data layers. I think a lot of people, it's been a long time since they've worked with a client that hasn't used a data layer. But in the last year and a half, 2 years, I've worked with more companies that haven't implemented a data layer than companies that have. So I resurfaced this, and I posted some blog post about CSS selectors versus data layers, which got a really interesting response. I thought it would just fly under the radar. I was like, I'll just make a bunch of memes. It'll be funny. Post it out there, and a couple people will be like, "Yeah, Jim, yeah." And then,
I reread it again this morning.
It's, but the thing is it got a lot more traction than I expected, because especially for a topic that I feel like people are tired of. And then I look at the summit agenda, and the agenda at summit's like all this futuristic, really cool stuff. And I'm sitting here thinking, like, man, a lot of folks still need to work on the basics, like data layers. So it's not as, people don't see data layers as a required step for an implementation. They don't see it as something that they have to have. And this is a broad statement. By people, I mean there is a significant amount of people who do not feel that a data layer is necessary to an implementation, and I think it is. And anyway, that's where this whole thing came from, is that original. I could keep talking about it.
No, you can, and that's why I think we could just go for forever. So I think,
Yeah.
So you published your most recent blog post titled "An Appeal."
Mm-hmm.
Is that a separate thread than your kind of desire that everybody should have a data layer? I'm wondering where we go next, because I would love for you to go down that path on why you believe that's the case, why you're seeing maybe a divergence from that, because I think historically we've seen in the last couple of years that almost be expected that you're going to do a data layer, but things change, right? So if you go back, we went from, well, everything's just going to be vendor specific as page code. Then we migrated to this thing called, what was it? Context data was kind of the next kind of thing, which was kind of an in-between step. And then the W3C stepped in and said, no, we're going to do this, data layer thing, which I think you have a problem maybe with the W3C standard. Where do you want to kind of branch off from there? Because I think there's a lot of different areas we can take this.
And before I start talking about the problems that I listed with my perceived problems with the W3C, I want to say that I've used W3C for a very long time. I think we've outgrown it at this point. It was a good intro. It was a good document to show people what a data layer looks like, but we've grown past that. The original purpose of writing the article, the original article that I was going to write was an appeal to Adobe. So the original goal was to start writing about, like, hey, I think Adobe should support, should build and support an integration for some sort of data layer. I get questions a lot from my coworkers who are and other people I've worked with, asking, "Hey Jim, what data layer do you use for Launch?" And I'm like, well, I typically start with the W3C, I guess, and then I bake in direct call rules. And you can technically pass in JSON objects with direct call rules, but maybe we should use something vendor agnostic. So let's look at custom events. And it kind of goes on to where it's like, okay, we have this W3C thing, and then there's this event-driven stuff that we don't have a clear answer. And then for some companies, the W3C doesn't work because they're like, okay, well, this JSON object is nice, and I know you want it to live in the header above this DTM or launch code, but our server response time isn't what we want it to be, or maybe it takes a little while to process like account details, so we have to populate this information later. And by the way, how do you want to trigger this page view if we don't know if this information is going to be propagated on DOM ready or window loaded? Anyway, it turns into this mess. And like, I consider myself on the more technical side of analytics at this point. I'm certainly not the most technical person, but
you're definitely more technical than most, because every time that I come up with some kind of need, I'm like, all right, I have to write some kind of crazy selector. I'm gonna go talk to Jim Gordon, and you're like, okay, here's this 6-level nested deep jQuery selector to get to what you want, and I wrote it in 45 seconds. So
it's I'm good at some things. Like jQuery is like a puzzle. It's fun, which is why it's tempting to use CSS selectors. I was talking to Jen Koons about it the other day, and we were talking about CSS selectors and how it feels like a puzzle sometimes to use it. And while it's fun, it's not the most productive method. But the thing is like I don't have an answer for people when they ask what type of data layer they should use. I legit don't. I have no idea. Like what's the most efficient? Like I'm thinking like, wow, this is a big company. They're going to be really mad if we have something that's polling a JSON object every half second or every quarter of a second. Some developer is going to come in and say, well, you're using our resources and blah, 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 even though like everyone's machine, everyone's processor or whatever is fast enough to support like, a polling method that polls an object every quarter of a second.
So
did I just jump into like way too technical
no,
stuff?
No, it's good, because it's what we hear all the time too. So I'm interested in what your response is, because oftentimes when I hear that question, I don't even think they're jumping to that level of complexity. Although they get there, I don't even think they're doing that yet. When I hear what kind of data layer should I use, they're really talking initially about structure, because you have the W3C standard, which is an object kind of oriented nested solution. You have other people that are dead set on it being flat. You have then vendors like Google and Telium that have their own unique way they want things structured. And they're not even thinking about the nuances of how do we capture events and how do we trigger things in a single page app environment. So
well,
how do you answer that question to guide them down the right path without it being so overwhelming that everyone just wants to throw their hands in the air?
I know. Well, it's tough. It's the answer is I don't. That's what I wanted to find out with this article. I'm not gonna make an appeal to Adobe and say, hey, you should implement something native for data layers without having some kind of recommendation. What you just said about the W3C, by default, you have to combine multiple methodologies and communicate multiple methodologies to a developer, right? I have my W3C data layer, and then I have something to handle events. To me, that's already too much. And I know that a lot of folks listening, it's like, oh, well, it's just two things. Like I get it. It's two things. It's a JSON object which developers understand, and then there's a method by which we pass data to a tag management system through some sort of event-driven data layer, which also technically makes sense, but it's a lot to explain. It means that in my documentation, I have this W3C thing and this W3C standard, I guess, and also this other thing, both of which constitute a data layer. And it just feels like a lot of work. It feels like a lot of work. And it's like, okay, what's the justification? And the first thing the developers are thinking of is, this is more work for me just to put data that's already been exposed on the page, right? And so they're like, okay, hang on. So we're writing this entire thing to pass events. We have this direct call rule. Okay, well, what happens on pages? What if we decide to take off Adobe DTM or Adobe Launch? Then we're going to be throwing errors. Great. Oh, now why did we buy this tag management system in the first place? I thought the whole reason we purchased this was to save us time, right? Because people like me sold this tag management system to developers saying this is going to save you time. And now we're like, oh, it will save you time. Just not in the short term. In the long term, it's going to save you time, right? And so we have to kind of change the way that we think about it, right? And we have to create new justification for this data layer. And I say it's new justification because the justification for a tag management system was it's going to save you time. Now I'm saying, oh, hey, remember when we used to implement things in line and y'all were cool with it then?
But were they cool with it? So
Sure.
what if we take the conversation away from the technical need? Can we
Mhm.
agree or maybe talk about that the fact that maybe it has created engineers, front end developers that are more informed and connected to what we're trying to do with digital data? And by that I mean
Mhm.
by having it as in the conversation as a data layer, something more native to their conversation, rather than set an EVAR or set it in this slot in this Google Analytics call. To them, that means absolutely nothing, and they're
Yeah.
disconnected from it.
Well, I think ultimately the direction that we're going is making it more semantic. And it's important for everyone to understand the business value behind what you're doing. Otherwise, what are you doing? If you if you're just operating, if you're just operating, you're just working operationally. There's
Right.
not a heck of a lot, in my opinion. There's nothing fulfilling about that.
Right. And I
So
would say that has been one of the upsides of moving to a data layer that I have seen, is that it's been easier to get engineers engaged as part of the team into what we're trying to solve, because now it's not something so foreign and
mhm.
disconnected from what they're doing.
And when you use frameworks and methodologies that when we start introducing different methodologies to define and pass values via some kind of data layer, that's when we start getting it invites more technical scrutiny, um, because there are a million ways to do one thing, and
Mhm.
without some kind of advocacy for a standard, in my opinion, from an Adobe or Google or whatever, uh, we're going to be caught in this loop of. For context, every single person I spoke to, which is about 12 to 15 people, had a different way of implementing a data layer.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
it's like I said in the blog post, we have a lot of different package sizes, right? Because what makes sense to you have think of a data layer like you're shipping a package, right? The package is the data that you want to ship to your tag management system, right? And it has to be shipped inside of a vehicle. The W3C did a really good job at trying to standardize the package. But what we figured out is that every business ships different sizes of packages. They don't want to have their package standardized. I've gotten on a lot of calls with folks who say, yeah, the W3C is okay, but it doesn't really suit our business needs because we have a very unique business that has very specific needs for a data layer and how I want to pass um, the data that I want to pass into my tag management system doesn't reflect what's recommended in the W3C. And I'm like, well, that's a problem with this.
Mhm.
That's a problem with the way that they were thinking about the original documentation. I don't necessarily think that they wanted to box anyone into a naming convention.
Is it,
Um,
but wait, is it a problem with how they looked at it initially, or is it a problem that they saw it as a one and done? Meaning, how often was the W3C
mhm.
standard updated as we learned more, as companies evolved in how they used data layers?
Well, it hasn't been updated since 2013.
So, I mean, I think that's part of the answer, right? Is
Oh
that
yeah.
maybe that's a big part of the problem, is that as we've learned in this industry, and I think many technical industries, that things change quickly. And if we look at any kind of standard or implementation as we stand this up once and we're done, is
Hmm.
destined for failure, right? Because we learn, things evolve, and we come up with better ways. And that makes it tricky because things are always in flux, especially for an organization like the W3C to keep it updated. And then maybe everyone gets upset because we're changing the spec and we're like, oh shit, we have to go back and redo everything. So what's the
Well,
answer? Can you go a little bit into your appeal? Because I'm interested in
here's
how. Yeah.
here's something interesting about the W3C, and you're right, things do evolve. And my recommendation is something similar to what Google created with their data layer push, or their data layer. What I recommended is it's kind of similar to what GTM is. Um, what's funny is Google was a contributor for the W3C standard. And while they were contributing to that W3C standard, they were building their proprietary data layer for Google Tag Manager at the exact same time. Joe Christopher, I think from Blast, actually tweeted the link to their I think it was their GitHub page, where they were working on a methodology which is totally different from the W3C. So while they were writing the W3C, they were also working on their own data layer.
And to be fair, there were like 50 other organizations on that committee, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, my guess is what's written in the W3C doesn't necessarily reflect the opinions of its authors.
Yeah.
Because how do you have 60 people?
Some kind of consensus, or someone was a stronger voice than others, for sure.
No doubt. Telium, it was the same. You know, Telium has their own way that they handle data layers, and so anyway, this whole thing was.
But let's earmark that, because I want to come back to that, because that to me is the how do you standardize it if everyone's going to come up, and your kind of appeal to Adobe to say, we need a standard. I thought that was the W3C's approach, is we're outside of everything, so we're going to come up with the generic standard, and then everyone's like, nah, it's a good idea, but we're going to develop our own standard. But doesn't that get away from the whole fact that we wanted something vendor agnostic so that we could move around?
The W3C was standardizing the package, though, right?
Okay,
they're trying to standardize.
I killed your flow, your mojo.
No worries.
Your package. So go back to your analogy with the package.
No worries. So the W3C spent most of its time focusing on how to design the package, right? The schema. And they accounted for events, certainly. They have the digital data dot events array. But, there's nothing that effectively there's no mechanism built into Adobe Launch that effectively observes there's the data element change, right? You could set that digital data dot events as a data element and monitor that using data element change. That's the closest native thing that we have to just using the W3C standard, right? But that monitors it every second. So we're subject to race conditions. And for those who aren't familiar, race conditions are basically you're seeing what gets done first. Either every second, Launch checks to see if an event was pushed into an array, or every second, Launch checks to see if a data element has changed. So if you push an event, if you click on a button and it pushes a JSON object into that array and the page changes, so you go from page A to page B, I better hope that Launch has pulled that data element in time before the page changes from page A to page B. Because if I go to page B from page A, before Launch pulls that object, I lose the data. Did I explain that okay?
No, you did, and it's a huge challenge, and it's becoming more and more complicated.
And if the only way to avoid those race conditions is to build your own event-driven data layer, that's it. That's your other option, is to have the W3C standard and also a different thing that you've built.
Yeah, and what we've seen, especially on the Adobe side, people doing is pushing to their data layer after it's been built as things come online. And you brought up really popular scenarios around fetching account details or other things from third parties, like maybe reverse IP lookups or things like that load later. And then their thing that they're using is direct call rules, because they're saying, okay, we can tell when we pushed an update to the data layer. Now we're going to call a direct call rule to go and fetch it. But it's not a very scalable solution.
No, it's not. And I've spoken with several companies recently who use both an Adobe Tag Management System and another one, either Google Tag Manager or Telium or Insighten. Not as many using Signal, but did you say
that because Jim's on the podcast?
No, it's honestly there's the vast majority are either GTM or DTM/Launch. I think Telium is probably the third of the people of my small hemisphere, of the sphere of people who I happen to talk to, it happens to be mostly DTM, GTM, and Telium. A little bit of Insight in here, in there, and I just talk to the wrong people. I need to spread my wings a little bit wider. And
No, I
and
think
find
I
some folks
think we
who-
see the same thing. So,
Yeah.
and we could probably have a whole other episode on the peaks and valleys of tag management. But at
Yeah,
one point in
yeah.
time, Insighten was the growing force and was everywhere. I don't know what happened there. They
It was
lost a
wild.
lot of executives. They lost a lot of their top engineers, and then Telium started injecting a lot of money into marketing. And so it's an interesting landscape.
It's a very, very interesting landscape. We'll save that conversation for next podcast, because yeah, that's a whole different thing. But the idea is, I have a lot of analysts who message me and ask where to start, right? And I wrote this article because I don't have a clear answer to that question, and I want to give them the solution that they'll leave on their site for 5 years at minimum. And I know that's maybe that's a pipe dream. Maybe I'm just being overly optimistic with how long a solution like that might last. But GTM's been pretty successful with their data layer.push for the last 5 or 6 years. So I think we can improve upon that. I think we can improve upon what Google's built, and create something that isn't totally foreign to people who are used to W3C.
Well, and one of the things that I honestly like about that, and I don't know if you've noticed this, would be interested in your comments, is that as with implementations of martech solutions themselves, everybody has, as you mentioned, their own idea of what a data layer should look like. And we've seen it time and time again where you have someone that architected the data layer leaves, someone new comes in, they're like, nope, redoing this whole thing. So they're in this constant cycle of rip down, rebuild. But if you have something where it's more formalized, then it's you know what I'm saying?
Everyone ships a different package. Right? Everyone has a different package that they want to ship. They want to change the structure. Oh, this structure doesn't make sense when I have, digital data.user.first name, digital data.user.last name, which, by the way, is PII. Don't do that. You
Probably
have
some
GDPR
people, violations in there.
Right? Everyone structures things differently. We shouldn't standardize the package. We should standardize the vehicle, or at least come close to standardizing some kind of vehicle. And I think that's where W3C has now been, in my mind, deprecated, right? It's documentation about the package that should be shipped. And I know it does talk a little bit about the vehicle, but the vast majority of content in the W3C standard is about the package. And I think we should focus on the vehicle and not the package. Because I'm going to be working with companies that ship all sorts of packages, all different shapes and sizes, all of which make sense for that business. And I'm still caught every single time in the same problem of how do I ship it? And I think we should standardize, or I think Adobe should create a way to a standard way to ship those packages. And the word standard is always like a totally, like, it's a trap word, because someone's going to come up and say, oh, well, you can't really create a standard. Or when you create 14 standards and you try to create one that standardizes one global standard, suddenly you have 15 standards. I get it. My appeal is for Adobe to create one. And that's it.
So, and I'm going to come back to that. The creating of standards is really difficult. Early in my career, I was on a subcommittee, and I didn't really do anything other than do a lot of listening with a lot of other companies that were trying to standardize, talking about the package and the delivery of the SOAP protocol. And I'm like, how the hell are we ever going to come to some kind of consensus that makes sense here? But back to your point, why Adobe? Like, I mean, is it for just Adobe Experience Cloud users that they're going to create a standard?
To me, if there's with no standard, we're communicating to our users that it's not a critical, in my opinion, we are communicating to our customers that a data layer isn't a prerequisite to an implementation. And in my opinion, a data layer is a prerequisite to an implementation. Sure, you can implement something without, you can drop the code on the page without a data layer, and yeah, okay, temporarily you can scrape from CSS. But in my mind, a data layer is absolutely a prerequisite to an implementation, and not natively supporting or not having something that's baked into Adobe Launch that supports that's a vehicle to send data from the page to the tag management system. That signals to users that, okay, this isn't something that's necessary for your implementation.
But isn't that what we dislike about Telium, is that they force us into their standard?
I think they create a flat object with their data layer, and first of all, that's sacrilege. But
we're gonna have to have some. Ooh, let's have someone from Telium and Adobe and Jim on as part 2, and we're gonna duke this out. I agree. I hate the flat. I don't like the flat.
I think people at Telium don't even like it, but I think there's some sort of architectural constraint where it's going to be tough for them to get out of that design pattern. I think I'm not very well versed in Telium, so I'm not going to speak on their behalf, and I'm not going to suggest that what people like or dislike about Telium has anything to do with the vehicle that they're using to send the data. But the one thing that causes me a lot of stress, because like most of my life, aside from my family, the other part of my life is analytics. Like, what causes me a lot of stress is figuring out how I'm going to send this data from my page to the tag management system. And, oftentimes it's just, we don't have, there's for folks who are less technically versed, at some point you're just like, screw it, we're just going to use CSS selectors. Because I'm trying to Google different ways to implement a data layer. As someone who isn't as technical, I'm putting myself in the shoes of any other analyst, and I'm trying to Google this stuff, and I can't find consistent information. Okay, this observe point article says I should override array.push, and also use it in tandem with W3C. Adobe says use W3C, but maybe use direct call rules, or I could also use custom events. This other person's telling me I should use HTML5 data attributes. And data layers aren't as necessary for stuff like clicks, so maybe we should just scrape from the DOM, which is a slippery slope, by the way. And for the other stuff, just use direct call rules, which, direct call rules are okay, but they're not vendor agnostic, and they don't really fit in too well with. You have to create a way to pass that information into something like a global JSON object. Otherwise, it's kind of tough to QA. So that's kind of what goes through my head when I think about, like, okay, well, why should Adobe do this? Like, why should Adobe do this? The reason is, every time I Google how should I do an Adobe Launch data layer, I can't get a consistent answer.
Yeah,
and it drives me up the wall. And a lot of people do this. A lot of, I'm not going to say most people, a lot of practitioners Google Adobe Launch data layer, and they're like, oh, hey, here's one methodology, this W3C thing. Oh, and by the way, make up your mind between these 5 other methodologies to pass event-driven data.
Yeah.
Stuff.
So I like it. My fear is that without a really strong educational push, that it's still going to be difficult. And by that I mean, even if we came up with a really strong workable standard, you're still going to have SaaS providers that their sales teams are going to position whatever is easiest for them to sell. You're going to have consulting agencies that are positioning whatever is going to sound best for them to win the deal to architect your data layer. Yeah. So how do we educate the buyers on the right questions to ask and the right standards to align with.
Adobe needs to make one. Adobe needs to make it. They need to support it. They need to make it. They need to support it, because otherwise it's a fight. Otherwise it's like,
but okay, but let me go back to my previous question. Is that because they're along with Google really the ubiquitous players in the enterprise space, or is it because we're talking about just those enterprise clients that are on the Adobe Experience Cloud? It's not clear in my mind exactly what you're proposing there.
Sure. So let's take a step back, and I'll explain why I feel Adobe needs to create it. Right now, I think we have some really viable options for data layers. I've talked to Wayne Wyatt from Traho yesterday, I think, and he built a really cool event-driven data layer methodology. I see Search Discovery created an awesome. Stu Schilling created a phenomenal extension for Adobe Launch, this data layer manager. There's a lot of other. I feel bad. I'm gonna miss some other folks who built really cool stuff, but there's a lot of options for data layers out there. Why should Adobe make one when there's all these options out here? I could pick from any one of these, which might be better than something that Adobe creates. And the reason is, as a consulting firm, I'm going to be hesitant to use something that another consulting firm has built. Number one, like me personally, my opinion doesn't matter here. Like, I don't care. I'll use what's best for the client, right? Or I'll use what's best for my own organization, because I'm looking at things from a totally neutral standpoint. I frankly don't care. I just want to do right by the client, But a lot of other people out there don't want to use something that's been built by a competing firm. And a lot of clients out there are skeptics. And rightfully so. Who is this company? Who is this 33 Sticks company? And why should I use for something as important as a data layer, something that's carrying sensitive information about my customer? Why should I put all of my trust in this vendor, who, by the way, I have 0 SLAs with? There's no guarantee that they're just going to up and abandon this project. I don't think they will, but there's no guarantee of that.
So asterisk small legal print, 33 Sticks decided not to do that because of that reason. No, it's a really good topic, because there are a lot of operational pieces that need to go into place, and we're not talking about small little shops here. We're talking about massive billion-dollar companies leveraging this. There's a ton of liability and things that need to be in place to support that.
And for the record, I'm not commenting on any company who's built a data layer. I've spoken, and I trust both Traho, Search Discovery. 33 Sticks hasn't built a data layer, and I don't think you plan on it, and I don't think you should, because I think Adobe should build it. But I think they're all excellent products, and I would trust that they are regularly updated. And this is by no means a guarantee, because I do not work for any of these companies. But I don't want to say that and make it sound like I don't think that these are actual risks with the companies that I mentioned. I don't think that they're not going to.
I thought you were a troublemaker. No, I agree. I think they're risks.
I'm a troublemaker for Adobe right now, and I feel really bad.
I think they're risks in general, but I think this is a whole other podcast, so we don't need to go too far down that path.
So that's one reason I think Adobe should create it, is because there are those questions out there that's like, okay, I don't know how much they're going, as much as they say that they will. Like, I trust you, but what happens if the lead developer leaves? Or what happens if they push a release and something breaks, which is a risk of any product that any company releases, even Adobe. So, but I don't think that it doesn't make it any easier on Adobe customers when we have 10 competing vendors all building their own data layer. None of which I can really trust as a third party, because I honestly don't know. I don't know if it's in my client's best interest to use data layer A or data layer B. And we have all this disparate documentation. So having Adobe build their own data layer framework, is framework the right word to use for this? Their own data layer vehicle.
Vehicle package scenario.
Consolidates documentation. So that's one huge benefit. I can search for Google Tag Manager data layer and I get 2,000 results, all completely relevant to that search query. I type in Adobe Analytics data layer and I get 7. I know this because I counted. I think it's in my article. 7 results. And it's frustrating because we're not really working together to build something which is critical to an implementation. We're not working together as an industry to build something that's better and to improve upon it. And it's like, yeah, okay, this data layer might not be perfect. It might not be something that will last, a decade, but at least we'll know how to iterate in the right direction instead of iterating in every direction.
So if you propose this to Adobe, they're going to come back to you and say, that's great, Jim, but that doesn't fit our product vision. Our vision for the product is that we wanted to create something that left the creative license up to the end user to create whatever they wanted to create. Mm-hmm. So what is your counter argument going to be back to Adobe that says these are the reasons why, other than it's broken right now? Like, how do you convince them that this is the right thing for them, for the industry, for their customers?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if I'm Adobe and I create this vendor agnostic-ish data layer, well, let's back up. Why even have a tag management system? I mean, it's a cost center for Adobe. They're not making money directly off of this tag management system. They have it, number one, because it makes it easier for customers to deploy Adobe tools, right? That's one huge value proposition. Another one is it keeps them in their ecosystem, which is a good thing if I'm Adobe and I want to keep folks in my product ecosystem. It takes a whole lot of work to migrate from Adobe to any other product if I have everything living in something like Adobe Launch. So in that spirit, I think for the same reason that a tag management system is funded, I think they should fund a data layer. In addition, building and maintaining their own data layer vehicle keeps people in their ecosystem. Because if I create something that is agnostic to tag management systems, I can switch over to something like Telium, which a lot of their customers use products like Telium and Insight, and they don't all use Adobe DTM and Launch. They are still using the data layer, which creates a dependency, which as Adobe, I kind of want to have a dependency with my clients because that keeps them in my product ecosystem. And that's kind of like a shady way of putting it, but I mean, let's be real. Like, as Adobe, I want to retain customers and I want to keep, I want to have the opportunity, every opportunity I can get to convert folks to more Adobe products. And building and maintaining their own data layer vehicle makes it that much easier to pull people back into the ecosystem if they wanted to experiment somewhere else.
Yeah. So, okay. So 2 questions as we're kind of wrapping up on time here. And I want to make sure we got through Jim's agenda. Jim, man, we're going to have to come up with some kind of nicknames here with 2 Jims on the call. With what, JD? J Driscoll. No, that's 2. Let's see. Jim D. So
You just say like Gymalytics for me, and then just call Jim.
It's too hard for me to pronounce Gymalytics for some reason. So 2 things. One, do you want to fly out to Utah and we can see if we can get some time with Adobe for you to present this, and then you and I can barbecue together?
Which Jim?
You.
Driscoll. Yeah, dude, of course. The thing is, I let me just say this. Corey Spencer and folks like Aaron Hardy, Jeff Chasen, Rudy Schumpert, and the rest of the lot. I'm sorry for causing trouble. I know that my writing this is like the last thing you probably want to have to deal with. It's like, oh my God, Jim's writing about this stuff again. And they do such fantastic work. And I want to say that this isn't necessarily the responsibility of the team that built Launch. I don't think that it's up to necessarily Corey's team, Corey and his team, to build this data layer product out. I don't think that necessarily lives with the Launch team. And if they do build it, Adobe should give them all huge raises and bonuses, because I think this can be seen as an independent product of Launch, and in my opinion, it should be an extension, so people aren't forced to use this library or this product. This is a product.
Yeah.
So I know, like, every time I post a blog post, it's usually it's a review of maybe it's a review of an extension, and it probably creates I create a lot of anxiety for a lot of people, and I feel bad about it. And
you shouldn't. It's needed, right? And you gave us like a mediocre grade or something, and people are like, "Whoa, Jim's hard, man." But it's important. We need. That's how we get better, right?
Yeah. I agree. And there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. And I hope that this is being seen as something that isn't malicious, or I'm not trying to throw anyone under the bus for anything. It's just, our industry is evolving, and I want to see Adobe succeed, because I think they build really, really good products. And I have a lot of really good friends who work there, and I want to see them succeed. So it's in my best interest for them to succeed because of that.
So the last question for now, and I say for now because I think we just scratched the surface, and I would love to have you back on, because I think this is a really interesting conversation, but very valuable conversation that I think a lot of our listeners will not only enjoy just listening to the conversation, but will hopefully take away some really valuable pieces of advice or things to think about based on what they've heard from you. So would love to have you back on shortly for a follow-up to this, because we just started to get into some of the interesting topics. But before we close out this episode, I would love to have you give your advice or things to think about. We know kind of where you stand with Adobe, and we need to get you out to Utah so we can all get together and chat. That would be amazing. Mm-hmm. But what advice would you have for agencies, for companies, when it comes to data layers as the current landscape exists today? So if I'm a company and I'm evaluating what I should be doing, if I'm an agency and I'm doing work with clients around data layers, what's the most important thing that you want those two populations to be thinking about?
Oof.
You can do it.
It depends on the context. Like,
well,
so what should they think about
in general? So we just had this really deep conversation about the reason why data layers are important, but maybe it's not working as well as it should. We talked about the fact that you hear from so many people says, what type of data layer should I be investing in? What's just the number one advice that you would give to companies and to consultancies that are dealing a lot in data layers?
Okay.
There's we're not going to judge you on this.
Yeah,
so don't freak out, man.
No. No, I'm going to judge myself later. That's what I'm very, very critical of what I put out there. I had to rewrite that article like 5 times. So the advice that I would give is, think about tomorrow, but do what you need to do today. So I put out there in the article that, in my opinion, tomorrow's best data layer will be an event-driven data layer. And I'm in the process of writing an article explaining what that is, what that means, why I think that, all that other stuff, in more detail than I had in my appeal article. But we don't have time to wait on tomorrow necessarily. So just because I don't think the W3C mixed with another methodology is the most optimal, and I don't think it will be the standard for Adobe, in several years. Don't let that stop you from evangelizing and implementing a data layer. The last thing I want to do is write something that convinces you to not implement a data layer, because I think that an event-driven data layer, or whatever data layer that Adobe hasn't built yet, just because I think that's a better methodology doesn't mean you shouldn't evangelize and implement one today. The part of that is, you're selling through the value proposition. So I need to do a better job at helping practitioners build the value proposition for a data layer. I think that's one of the biggest barriers preventing people from implementing, or stopping people from implementing the data layer, is the value. We don't have a well-constructed value proposition. There's one there, but it's not. We're not all communicating the same thing. And my commitment is, I'm going to do a better job with what I write and communicating that value proposition. So that's another article. So I mean, you see how deep this thing goes. You start talking about one thing, it's like, oh, I want Adobe to standardize a data layer. Now all of a sudden we're talking about this other stuff. So if I have one piece of advice, don't let my comments stop you from implementing a data layer. I don't think you will. And if you can manage to implement an event-driven data layer up front, great. But I completely understand if you don't, because there's no documentation about that.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I don't know if that's my one takeaway.
Awesome.
That's what it would be.
Dude, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on, and we'll definitely schedule a part 2 of this, because again, I think we just started scratching the surface on a lot of really interesting topics. So we will have you back and continue to go into this. But great conversation. For those listening, if you haven't checked out Jim's content, we'll link up his blog and some of the other content he puts out there. It's really amazing stuff. As Jim Driscoll mentioned, I Google his cheat sheet at least 3 or 4 times a week, and it'd be super easy for me just to download the PDF, but I get a little bit of satisfaction thinking that Jim Gordon looks at his analytics and looks at the GR report and says, I bet that's Jason.
I do. It's sad. That's still the page that receives the most traffic on my site, is people coming in from Google, searching for the cheat sheet. Don't be ashamed, but feel free to print it out, post it up.
It's also such a good resource.
Check out Tagtician and the data layer viewer. I created this data layer viewer thing recently, which is super handy. Basically, it's like a bookmarklet. You click on it, and every time an event fires, it shows you what the data layer, your data elements. It's a data element viewer.
Yes.
Sorry, I've been talking too much about data layers.
So
data element viewer.
I will link all that up. It is all useful stuff, and in addition to the cheat sheet,
free.
It's free. Jim has put an amazing amount of work into it, and Tagtician I use on a daily basis. So I'll link that all up. If you're not checking out his content, if you're not using these tools, and you work closely in the space, you're definitely missing out. So thanks again for joining us. Awesome conversation, and really look forward to you coming back to the 33 Tangents podcast studio.
Hey, thanks, guys.
Yeah. So shortly after we wrap up here, I'm going to work to get part 2 scheduled, because one of the things, with part 2, I want to get into, and why I want to get it scheduled right away is I want to get into why these conversations are important. Why, how did we get to this point? Where were we before? What happened when TMSs were introduced? And talk more strategically about availability of data and why a data layer is important. So, Jim, I will get that on our calendar to record very, very soon. But yeah, we'll definitely. I want to make sure we hit those topics, because I think talking about those helps arm people when they start to get into the really fine details like we talked about today. And this has been something Jason and I have been working on, God, since I joined 33 Sticks, is how to arm our stakeholders with all the information when they go to their program managers, their architects, and saying they need this.
Agree. Yeah. Cool.
Cool. Well, guys, I really appreciate the time. This was awesome, and so we'll go ahead and wrap up for now.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to reach us, you could do so by emailing podcast@33sticks.com or on the web at www.33sticks.com. The 33 Tangents podcast is a production of 33 Sticks.